Before communism, Mongolia's economy ran on trade, livestock, and centuries-old herding systems. It wasn't rich, but it worked. The seasons dictated movement, herders managed their own herds, and trade with China and Russia brought in essentials. Then, in 1924, Mongolia became the world's second socialist state, and within decades it was transformed into a satellite economy for Moscow's benefit. In 1948, Soviet advisors drafted Mongolia's first five-year plan, not in Ulaanbaatar, but in Moscow. The plan's goals? Turn a nation of herders into a resource extraction hub for the USSR. By 1952, over 90% of Mongolia's investment came straight from the Kremlin. This wasn't partnership, it was economic occupation. The Soviets built copper mines in Erdenet, coal pits in Baganur, and entire processing plants for hides and wool. Between 1950 and 1960, the number of industrial enterprises tripled. Electricity output rose by more than 1,000%. But all of it was designed to serve Soviet needs, not Mongolian independence. Copper accounted for over 40% of exports by the late 1970s, almost all going to the USSR at prices well below the world market. Mongolia imported nearly everything it couldn't produce: machinery, fuel, and even basic food grains, all heavily subsidized by Moscow. The country was locked into a single export market and a single supplier for almost all essentials. It was dependency by design, and it left no room for economic choice. Agriculture was forced into the Soviet model of collectivization. By 1960, 99% of herders were in state-run cooperatives. The nomadic migration routes that had worked for centuries were abandoned in favor of fixed, state-approved grazing zones. Decisions were made by distant bureaucrats with no knowledge of local conditions, and when the harsh dzud winters came, there was no flexibility to adapt. The disaster of 1967-68 saw over 2 million livestock perish, around a quarter of the national herd. Because central planning couldn't respond to reality, these losses weren't rare. Harsh winters in 1977, 1983, and 1987 wiped out hundreds of thousands of animals each time, but the system carried on unchanged. Every loss meant less meat, less wool, less income, and greater reliance on Soviet grain imports to feed the population. By the late 1970s, more than half of Mongolia's GDP came directly from Soviet aid, subsidies, or rigged trade agreements. Officially, the country had over 120 industrial enterprises. In reality, many produced goods nobody wanted or broke down while waiting months, sometimes years, for spare parts. A fifth of the industrial workforce was effectively idle, kept on payroll for propaganda statistics rather than production. For the Soviet Union, this was not a failed system. It was working exactly as intended. Mongolia was a loyal supplier of raw materials, a market for Soviet goods, and a buffer state with no independent economy. Then came the late 1980s. The Soviet Union itself was collapsing under its own economic failures. Fuel shipments to Mongolia were cut by half. Aid was slashed. Moscow demanded hard currency payments and world prices for imports. Within 2 years, Mongolia's GDP shrank by 20%, industrial output fell by 30%, and inflation surged into triple digits. Entire factories stood idle because they couldn't get a single part from the USSR. When the aid stopped entirely in 1991, the illusion of development collapsed. Mines closed, factories shut down, and unemployment exploded. The collectivized herding system disintegrated almost overnight, forcing people back into traditional nomadic life, but without the wealth of herds they had before communism. Mongolia's economy reverted to exporting raw cashmere and meat, the same low-value trade it had before 1924. Today, the skeletons of Soviet-built industry still stand in the Mongolian steppe: rusting smokestacks, abandoned workshops, and silent conveyor belts. These are not monuments to progress, but to dependency, waste, and the total failure of central planning. Communism didn't modernize Mongolia. It hollowed it out, tied it to a foreign master, and left it to collapse when that master died.